What is the saddest thing you have heard a child say? I supervise foster homes. A few years ago, one of my foster families had taken placement of a little boy named Chris. Chris was husky and socially awkward, but also impossible to dislike. He was mostly quite a real observer but would sometimes come out and say the most outlandish comments. There were many times that Chris had me laughing to the point of tears, taken aback by his dry wit. Despite this engaging sense of humor, Chris had a rough start in life. He had never met his father and his mother had died of a drug overdose several years prior. Chris had bounced in and out of 7 different foster homes by the time I met him. All of his younger siblings had been adopted and he saw them infrequently. When he did see them, Chris was prone to intense mood swings. It must have been incredibly difficult for him to watch his siblings grow up together while he waited for his forever family. Shortly after his 11th birthday, Chris moved into the foster home that I supervised. The foster family was taken with Chris right away. They'd always wanted a child and they seemed to relish in acting out their dream of parenthood immediately. They spoiled Chris, taking him on expensive shopping trips and excursions. Their intentions were good. Knowing that Chris had experienced a lifetime of neglect in only 11 years, they seemed set on showering him with love and affection to make up for lost time. If Chris didn't want to go to school, the foster parents would shrug and take him to the park. If he wanted to stay up all night and play video games, they happily allowed it. At first, this was fantastic. Chris was having a ball. When I would visit him, he seemed to be blossoming. The kid who had barely spoken a full sentence to me was suddenly bursting at the seams to tell me every detail of his day. When I expressed my concern that their lack of rules could be leading to problems down the road, the foster parents insisted that they had it under control. They said they loved Chris. They called him son. After about 6 months, an adoption date was set. Chris was so excited about picking out a suit and tie to wear to the courthouse. The trouble started about 3 weeks before the adoption hearing. The foster parents had grown tired of the honeymoon stage. They'd realized it was time to start setting up boundaries that would help Chris grow into the fine young man we all knew he could be. Chris, who'd become accustomed to a house with no rules, responded as you might expect. He was confused and frustrated at the family's sudden insistence on rule setting. One evening, the foster parents asked Chris to turn off the television and go to sleep. He refused. They threatened to ground him. He laughed. The foster parents began to yell, exasperated. Chris picked up his brand new cell phone and threw it into the television, destroying the screen. Both foster parents yelled louder, which only worsened Chris's blow-up. He kicked the wall, denting it. He told the foster parents that he hated them and hated their house. The foster parents called me, panicking. I reminded them that children who have experienced trauma sometimes struggle to regulate strong emotions. I explained that we all needed to work together in order to help Chris adjust to having rules put in place. I explained that although their intentions were good, Chris had been set up to fail. They calmed down and we set a meeting for the next day. I went to their house first thing in the morning, ready to help them come up with a plan to support Chris. Chris had already gone off to school when I got there. The foster parents looked me straight in the eye and told me they wouldn't be picking him up from school and would not be adopting him in a few weeks. I was shocked. They had professed love for this child for nearly a year at this point. I pleaded with them and offered every support I could think of. They would not budge. All of a sudden, they began listing every annoyance they had with Chris, going back to when they first met him. It was as if they'd been building up this list all this time, too afraid to admit to me that they'd had their misgivings from the start. I begged them to pick him up from school. The last thing I wanted was a caseworker showing up to whisk him away. He already hated school. This would only make him worry that every school day could end with his life being uprooted. They were too worn down, too guilty, and too upset. I picked Chris up from school. When he got into my car, I could see that he knew what was happening. His round face was knotted in concern, his eyes filling with tears. He begged me with a desperation that I've never seen in a child. He wanted me to tell the parents he was sorry, that he would never mess up again if they agreed to keep him. I told him that it wasn't his fault, that parents need to understand that all people make mistakes. I told him he deserved someone who would be patient with him. I drove Chris to a new foster home with a lovely set of people who, unfortunately, could only take him in for a few days due to their housing setup. When we got there, he didn't want to go in. We sat on the front lawn for almost 2 hours. He was really quiet, just leaning back into the grass with his hands on his stomach. Finally, as it started to get dark, he tapped me on the shoulder. I'm not going to get adopted, am I? Chris's voice was small, barely a whisper. Although I wanted to tell him this wasn't true, I've learned never to make a promise I cannot 100% keep. What makes you say that, Chris? I'm messed up. If I didn't mess up so much, someone would love me. I'm a bad kid. Chris looked at me with these big, brown eyes and I knew in my heart that he believed those words without a hint of doubt. In all that had happened to him, Chris had learned that he was unlovable. It was the most devastating moment of my career to look at a child whose grief was so deeply etched into his own sense of being. That's a belief that I knew Chris would battle his entire life. Some good did come from this horrible experience, however. Desperate to find a loving home for him, his caseworker contacted his maternal side of the family and explained what had happened. Up until this point, they'd staunchly refused to give even a hint of his dad's name. After weeks of pleading, they finally gave us a name. Unfortunately, Chris's dad had died years before, but he had a brother. This brother had never even known Chris existed, but he was thrilled. He and his husband had recently adopted a little girl and had been talking about opening up their home to a second child. It was serendipitous. Chris was not an easy kid, he was angry, rightfully so, and balked at rules. The family did not give up. They jumped through every hoop so that they could become foster parents to him. Chris was just adopted a few months ago and he seemed happier than I've ever seen him. It's not perfect. Chris has many wounds to heal from, but I know he is in a place where he is loved and cherished as he deserves.